Thank you, Scott, and thank you all very much. Those of you who were involved in planning this, I know I had the honor of planning the same conference 2 years ago and know that it takes a lot of work. So if you haven't already found your local conference planning committee, grab them, thank them, high five them, maybe buy them a beer. And then thank you all for having us here today. We appreciated the 52-minute flight that turned out to be an hour and 52 minutes. And we're happy to be hanging out with you all for this afternoon and a little bit tonight as well. I think before we get into the work that we've done and sharing that approach and those results with you, we always spend a few times on the top kind of giving you a state of the state from our perspective when it comes to retail cooling practices. And maybe look at it through a bit of a critical lens and critique a bit of what's going on right now when it comes to both how we inspect retail cooling practices and also how industry is approaching their methodologies and their approaches to cooling down cooked foods. So this is actually a great segue, and Cindy really got us going on the last presentation because our first slide here is all about our own risk factor analysis.
Yeah, so in Minneapolis from 2014 to 2016 data, we performed a risk factor analysis, one of those local ones that Cindy referenced earlier, and we looked at how often we were calling things, and notably with that in, out, NA, and NO discussion, also how often we were observing risk factor violations. So these violations you're going to see in a sec are at our highest risk establishments. And the first group are kind of those ones that we call out a lot, and also we see them a lot. So it's kind of your classic like date marking. There are usually foods in the facility that need to be date marked. Right? The next group are those that we see a lot, but maybe we don't call so often. So one of these would be unapproved source. Most people have a handle on that by now. The third group are those that we don't call a lot, but also we don't see them very often. So this would be like cooking shelled eggs to 145 degrees. And then it turns out that we had one more quadrant, and the only thing left in it was cooling time temperature requirements. And it really got us thinking about, we really don't see cooling very often, and then when we do, we're calling it out a lot. Pretty much up there with the top of our risk factors.
It kind of got us thinking, are we really just seeing the tip of the iceberg? Is there a larger problem that we're not identifying that's happening underneath the surface? And we're not observing it, but when we are, that's a high percentage of time, there's a lot going on that we're not seeing.
Right.
But we actually took a look at something that we probably see a lot more often, and that's the technique itself. We're seeing cooked foods in these restaurants. These restaurants are high-risk facilities. They go through that danger zone twice. So there's probably food in that restaurant that has been cooked, and whether it's still in its original container or it's moved containers, a conversation or observation can get us to seeing a cooling violation. Looked up those numbers, and we were calling cooling violations of the technique 12% of the time. Now, our study itself isn't necessarily about how often retail food establishments fail. Luckily, we have those in front of us, like Cindy, who've already analyzed this. She indicated that actually 72% of these restaurants are failing. Our study, we also did look at that just for fun, and it turned out that 61% of our participants were failing to meet their cooling requirements as well.
We should say that while our study was not about looking at this, there was also some serious affirmation bias at play. When we went to work at these restaurants, they knew we were coming. They knew we were coming to study their cooling, and we're their local inspectors, not specifically us necessarily, but we work for the same department, and there was probably a lot of reason for them to want to please us and make us happy and impress us.
I mean, not just that, I don't know about you, but I was doing most data collection middle of the week, non-volume time periods, mid-morning, mid-afternoon. I wasn't walking in these places at 6:30 to collect data. So I think there's something to be said for how many eyes are on the prize, so to speak, when we're in there as well. So I think if we look at like what's more realistic of, say, any given Sunday, I think that we're pretty comfortable in that 70% or higher situation. But I think the really big takeaway here is that there's a huge discrepancy from how often we're calling a cooling method violation and how often people are failing to cool their food down correctly. Clearly, we feel like more has to be done to evaluate this particular part of retail food.
I mean, cooling is hard, right? Cooling's hard for operators for a lot of reasons. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that Nick doesn't tell me about his 16 years in the restaurant industry. I mean, take us through why cooling is hard from someone who's had that experience, who's been there.
Sure. I mean, I don't think I really have to even harken my experience. I think that all of us have been in a restaurant and we've seen how chaotic and how hectic the back of the house can be. And we're not even seeing it more than likely at 6:30 on a Saturday. If I can kind of maybe make an analogy here, if we have parents in the room, especially those that are young parents or who were once young parents, I like the idea of comparing parenting in the same kind of multitasking conversation. Our chefs are in the back of the house, they're managing the tickets that are coming in off the counter, and they're oftentimes hitting the floor at peak volume. They're managing sanitation, they're managing communication with the front of the house, they're answering the door being rang in the back of the building, and then we're gonna throw on an activity that they're also managing, and that's the cool down of their bulk recipes. Now this particular monitoring takes a lot of verification to it as well, right? Us in regulation, we're asking them to verify, maybe use a log. So that person in the back of the house is gonna have to find their thermocoupler, find their Sani swab, go to the food, find the hottest part of the food, take a temperature reading. Hopefully it's below 135, maybe it's not for the 30 minutes yet, so they go back, 30 minutes later, they forget about the fact that the food's there. I mean, I don't think I have to get into this much further to kind of paint the picture that this probably isn't something that can be sustainably done each and every time that prep cook or that line cook or that back of the house manager is monitoring their cool down of foods.
I think that what we want to advocate for is maybe changing our approach and kind of turning it on its heel and asking, what would chef do? What is a repeatable, sustainable kind of step number 8 in the recipe? Hey, cool foods down, not just cool foods down, but cool them down in this way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that chefs by nature they're very concrete, sequential in their work.
Right.
They may be very interesting people outside of their work, but I think their job requires them to be very concrete, sequential. And they understand and can implement problem solving based on process control. And if we can digest that cool down into, do step 8 and it's cool the food like X, Y, and Z. That's easier to teach, easier to vet as the chef or the person in charge. And for all of us in the room, it should be easier to inspect as well.
Right, because inspecting cooling is hard, right? I mean, it's not unreasonable to think that we don't see cooling that often. Of course we don't, right? Inspections are a snapshot in time. We're not there ever to see a full-length cooling curve, right? Who has ever seen a full cooling curve in their inspections? Probably no one. Hopefully you guys aren't at your restaurants for 7 hours, right? I mean, it's tough.
Right, and then not just that, there's also kind of this baked in aspect that if we do get a chance to see multiple data points of a cooling curve during our inspection, our first data point is usually relying upon a conversation with the person in charge. Let me kind of paint you a picture a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So you're in your inspection, you go in the walk-in cooler, you got the chef right next to you, you're talking about how awesome the twins are, you see this deep cambro, you see condensation on the top of the lid, you are telling yourself, this is the moment I'm gonna get the opportunity to see food cooling down. You open up the cambro, stick that thermocoupler in, 97 degrees, you're like, yes, I got him. We're gonna make something happen, we're gonna change techniques right now. So I look to the person next to me, the person in charge, and I say something like, well, how long ago did you start cooling the food down?
Not that long ago, maybe an hour.
Right? I mean, it might not be that Logan is a pathological liar, and maybe he is, I'm not really gonna throw you under the bus that hard. But I think that a lot of our chefs, they know at the very least the right answer. They know how to answer a question that we really have no other way of attacking with an answer that's gonna appease us, move us on to the next category, and not admit guilt. My sense is that when we are calling the temperature time violations as a cooling violation, we're seeing next day overnight cooling. We're not being able to use that first data collection point to justify us to call that violation or to discard that food away, because it's very easy to walk out of that scenario.
There's one thing that is right in front of you though in that situation, and it's the method, right? It's what containers, what unit, how deep is the food, how is it cooling? That can't lie to you. It's in front of you, right?
You can measure it. It feels like a lot better science than guessing upon a fictitious conversation.
Yeah, so that's part of why inspecting is hard. Yeah.
Okay, so Cindy left, so we can probably actually have a pretty critical FDA conversation now. Go ahead and pop us into this one.
Yeah, so the next part of our journey then was to say, well, if we're not, the status code is broken, cooling is hard, inspecting is hard, let's turn to the code for some answers, right? So food code tells us how to cool foods down, right? It lists the 7 methods, which you guys are seeing behind us. It tells us to put food in shallow pans. It tells us to use materials that facilitate heat transfer. It tells us to, what does it tell us to do?
I think that the point is that it's kind of using words like shallow, but what is shallow? Is it 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches? What is a pan that facilitates heat transfer? Is that ceramic? Is that stainless? Is that aluminum? Could that be plastic? rapid cooling equipment, is that 1 wand, 2 wands? Is it an effective wand? Is it actually just a blast chiller? There's not limits, thresholds, boundaries, definitions. It feels a lot more like philosophical musing than it feels like a concrete roadmap that you and I during inspection can use and that operators can use to guarantee themselves a certain level of success.
Right.
I think that the great analogy is...
it makes me think of Google Maps, right? The reason we love Google Maps is because it tells us when to turn, and it also tells us where to turn, right? It gives us some pretty concrete, specific direction. But imagine if we took away the when. We'd kind of be lost, right? Just the where.
I mean, could you imagine if we chose not to do the flight and drove here today and knowing how much you can take the car out of your apartment downtown? Would we even have made it to Omaha?
I wouldn't be here right now, that's for sure. Yeah. I mean, so knowing that, we turned to the annex next, saying this is it. This is where FDA gets to expand upon their thoughts, add a little more color maybe.
You can find some studies, some empirical data,
Yep.
maybe some of those critical limits that we're looking for so desperately.
Yeah. So we did it. We pulled this for you guys. Don't take the time to read it. Don't bother. We annotated it for you. We'll run you through it now. This first part tells us
We can always just make, if you do make more food, it takes longer to cool.
Right. This next part is...
It's just really indicating that within this paragraph there's duplicate information, so we can minimize that text for you a little bit. Our next strikeout indicates that, well, that operator could always just make less food, or they could change their process to be a heat serve location. Mm-hmm. I'll let you all try out those kind of conversations. Yeah. And then finally,
the last one is really just buy a blast chiller, which is a tough sell, I think, for most places. What we're left with is about 2.5 sentences that didn't define for us any thresholds, didn't really give us any concrete measurements. And it's really just a rehash of a couple of the methods that are listed in the actual code.
Right, yeah. Right. So I think this, after all this digging and looking around, and this is kind of where we got to that apex where we're like, we need to make some changes within our framework of how we do our job. We need to find opportunities in our day-to-day operation to call cooling interventions more frequently and to intervene more frequently, and hopefully those interventions can lead to less examples of improper cooling. Right? And I think we really wanted to distill this down to a practical model. If we could find the variables, put them into an equation, find some limits, digest it down to something that was practical, sustainable, easy to rinse and repeat, well, then we think that we really have something that we can give to an operator or give to an inspector, and we can really, hopefully move that needle forward.
Right, and in thinking about how we might put forward a model or a tool for us to use and how do we successfully cool, we turned to some previous research, and it turns out that there was a gap in research about effective cooling methods. One of the first things we found were the FDA risk factor studies that didn't dive so much into how effective specific methods were, but rather how often places are failing, like Cindy mentioned. And then we also found a great study from the EHS SNAT.
Right. So that study was taken, I want to say, around the turn of the decade, 2010, and then it was further analyzed in 2013 by the folks on the SNET study. Nicole Hadina out of Minnesota is someone locally that we were able to talk with and work with and give us the pathway, as well as Dr. Don out of Rutgers. They used that analysis and they put forward a predictive modeling for cooling. And that was based out of a whole plethora of data collections, 500 recipes roughly. But one thing it relied upon was 2-point data collections. So somebody would be there, an inspector, they would take data point 1, data point 2, and measure the difference between those 2 points, and then they would distill that down with one variable, temperature of the unit or of the environment, and they put forward a predictive model. And the authors themselves kind of concede that the biggest weakness here is that they didn't use continuous time temperature monitoring. They kind of maybe thought that what happens between those 2 points might have some impact.
Right. Yeah, and so this drove us to say, well, maybe we need to investigate into our own data collection. And before we get into telling you guys about how we did it specifically, we owe some huge thank yous to the people on the screen behind us. Nicole Hadine, like Nick mentioned, from MDH, helped us get off the ground. Dr. Don Schaffner sat with us, had a phone call before we started. And then our Minneapolis environmental health and research and evaluation teams have been invaluable.
As I mentioned, data collection wasn't just us. We had a whole team of people who have done it and helped us out with operator analysis. So they're not all here right now, but thanks to all of those folks for sure.
Definitely, yeah. So addressing those 2 data points, right? Like you might see on an inspection, obviously not over 7 hours, but maybe over 30 minutes or an hour. You can guess what might have happened between, and that's what they were trying to do in that EHS SNAT study. But there's a ton of things that could have happened between those two data points, right? I mean, any number of these curves that you guys are seeing are legitimate things that could have happened.
Let me guess, we saw all these cooling curves.
Yeah, those 3 dotted lines are all 3 cooling curves that we saw during our study. All took about the same time to cool. And it probably has some pretty significant public health impact.
Yeah, you can imagine that the one on top, the one on bottom, we definitely spent a lot different times in the middle, right?
Yeah, and this is what really drove us to take continuous time temperature measurements.
Right. So really what we got into is we went and sought out restaurants. We made a list of our restaurants that are risk 1 or high risk, kind of vetted their menus on Google and kind of decided, okay, this crew of people, it's like about 1,000 or so, most definitely probably cool. And we just took chunks in areas of the city that were easier for us to get to or that we might have already kind of had a relationship with, cold knocked on their doors and said, hey, we'd love to come in and see what you're doing, look at your techniques and measure the process of your actual cooling. And so why don't you go ahead and show them the form that we used.
Sure, so this is the form we used. We were trying to measure a lot of techniques while we were out there. We measured what type of unit is it coming through? Okay, there was a brightness issue earlier. What type of unit the food was in. Was it covered? Was it mixed? Did they use an ice wand, an ice bath? What depth was the food? How much was it filled in that pan?
Did they use metal or plastic? Did they use an ice bath? If so, was it used correctly? Did they use a wand? If so, was it used correctly? We measured the depth down to the 1/4 inch. We measured the temperature down to the 1/10 of a degree. And we also even tried early on to get a lot of information about the food intrinsic properties themselves. Was it a liquid or solid? Was that liquid smooth or chunky? And we even tried to take density early on and kind of soon realized that we were really failing at that. So that's didn't become part of the process. And we even left ourselves a notes category that was kind of imperative as we dug in further to understand some of the nuances and cool techniques out there. And we're going to show you some examples later that really came from this part of the form itself.
Right. And this is what allowed us to do it. This is the temperature data logger. The silver part is the actual thermometer, and the kind of housing around it, the dongle, is the part that we were able to tie some floss into and throw into the food, and it would take a temperature data point every 3 minutes.
I know what you're all thinking. I'll give you a little bit of calming words of wisdom. This is NSF, easily cleanable, heat resistant, non-leaching, all those good things. The floss that we used was non-scented, non-waxed. We didn't lose any data loggers. We didn't have any yellow foreign objects.
Yeah.
And it kind of allowed us to do things like this. So we could put it into solid foods. We could put it into foods that were kind of in between solid and liquid. And then we even got ourselves into some really cool scenarios where we had some chefs who were like, I see what you're doing. Let me give you single variable scenarios. Let me fill you 2 pans side by side, same product, same fill, but we'll toggle the material type. So we got some really enriched data and got a chance to have a lot of interesting conversation and learned a ton as well.
Yeah, we were able to spit out graphs like this, which showed the temperature over time, how long things took to cool. And then we were also able to give the operators some feedback. We wanted to give them a token of our appreciation for participating. We gave them a rundown of how they performed, did they meet the food code requirements, and some quick recommendations on how they might improve if they needed to.
Yeah, I mean, we actually found ourselves in some of our worst performing places using this as a technique or a method to consult people into better techniques, show them that data, and then give them the confidence that that new process was vetted. So we found ourselves actually doing quite a bit of education just kind of on accident, which I think was a cool takeaway as well.
Yeah. I mean, after we started getting a lot of recipes, we asked ourselves how we were going to actually measure their success. We realized we couldn't just sit on this data and not do anything with it, right?
Initially, we hypothesized that we would just use the FDA cooling curve, right? I mean, that's relatively straightforward. We all kind of knew it. It was easy to understand, 135 to 41 in 6 hours. But I think the more and more we got into these really deep down the well, we started asking ourselves, well, what does it all mean? What does it all matter? What's the why? What are we trying to do in this situation as sanitarians? Well, we're trying to prevent the growth of spore formers and their corresponding toxins. So we started looking at those microbes themselves, and we started talking about Clostridium perfringens and B. cereus and Staph aureus. And this is not an epi presentation, but some of the epi did kind of drive our decision making here as well. At least in Minnesota and pretty much within the whole nation, 10% of our foodborne illness outbreaks are derived from bacterial intoxications. Within that pie, 85% of those are coming from Clostridium perfringens. And Clostridium also happens to have the largest growth range when it comes to what environment can support its growth, 122 to 59 degrees. So we kind of had a new way of looking at what was a good result.
Yeah, and there were a lot of recipes that prompted us to have that discussion. This is one of them. It's a ramen broth that we saw cooling. Their curve is in the lighter blue, and then the FDA required minimum curve is in the dark blue. This recipe took, after 2 hours, it should be at 70 as we know. This one was at 51, so really great.
Yeah, high five, gold star, pat on the back, see you next year, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, we can imagine a situation where a different inspector walks in maybe next year, pretend it's the same cooling curve. After 6 hours, it should be at 41, it was at 49.
It's a much more challenging conversation, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're questioning if you should discard the food and maybe the whole thing needs to be blown up. But I think it kind of got us challenging the notion of, where does the risk overlay with the code, and where should we be putting our attention? What part of the cooling curve is really where we should be investing our time and our recommendations and our influences?
Right, this curve took 13 hours to cool this food, but it only spent an hour in that Clostridium growth range. And this is a great example of a really big disparity between those two, and it's what drove us to ask more about why. So if we were going to use the Clostridium growth range as a means for success, we had to know what was good. What is an appropriate amount of time to spend from 122 to 59, right? And so what we did was we built a food code minimum required curve, and it turns out it spends 2.5 hours in the Clostridium growth range.
Right, so now we had it. We had a result method that we could compare it to. We could say, did that cooling curve spend more or less time than 2.5 hours in the Clostridium growth range? So we're gonna kind of walk you through a bunch of our results next, and hopefully flesh out some cool conversations that are really technique driven. The first thing that we're gonna kind of point you to is one of my favorite slides that Logan here is great at making, and that's these ideas of these risk bubbles. Okay, so we were already kind of framing the conversation in risk. So we broke up all of our recipes. At this point, we're at 210. We should probably indicate to the room that we're not done with data collection yet. We're taking data collection through the end of October, and then we're going to dive into a whole lot more statistical analysis. But right now, we're at about 210, and out of that collection, we have 39% that fall in our lowest risk bubble. These are ones that spent less than 2.5 hours in the high risk zone, aka compliant, right? Yeah. So the other 61% fell in the other two bubbles.
Right, this next one is our medium-most group, our middle-most group. And if you guys can think of a word that describes the middle-most thing, please come talk to me afterwards, because I got a beer for you. We've got nothing. It's not out there, I'm telling you. That middle-most group is those recipes that spend 2.5 hours to 5 hours in the Clostridium growth range. And then the last one, the highest risk group, the kind of 25% of our data set, spent 5 hours or more in that growth range.
I mean, I think there's definitely some room to pause and digest that for a minute. If we as sanitarians are going to attack those 10% of all our outbreaks that are bacterial intoxications, we think that 24% risk bubble is probably where we should be focusing our efforts. Those are the most likely to be leading to outbreaks.
Yeah. This next slide is about covering your food and providing an air gap. And this is actually section B of that method's call in the food code.
Yeah, I guess this is maybe relevant to our state because we just adopted a new food code after a very, very long time. And it's when it comes to the cooling methodology, we're essentially carbon copying the 2013 FDA cooling curve. That's what we showed you earlier, FDA cooling citations. So earlier we showed you that list, and part B in that list are actually things that the operator needs to be doing independent of what they do out of those 7 methods. They also need to not cover or loosely cover and need to provide an air gap. So there's regulatory reason for us to be calling those violations anyways. There's also some math to back up those staples, those necessities.
Yeah, right? We'll try and want to paint this picture to you guys as this needs to be your baseline to work off of when your facilities are cooling. Call these violations. Recipes that were covered in our data set, 12% are spending a high amount of time in that, on average, in that high risk range. When we uncover those recipes, the majority of our recipes, to be fair, so it drives that time in the high risk down a lot.
Yeah, quite a bit of a difference.
Yeah, definitely.
And then the idea of an air gap, right? So thankfully also, not a huge percentage of our operators are not using air gaps. It's roughly 1 in 5 are choosing to not use an air gap, and they also spent a lot of time in that high risk zone on average. You contrast that to those that were using an effective 2-inch air gap around the entire food product, and you're seeing a significantly less amount of time in the high risk zone on average.
It's worth your time to address these and write these violations when you guys see them.
I think all of our other methodology that we're going to walk you through, whether it be depth or material type or ice, it's hinging upon the idea that these things are being done as a baseline staple.
Right.
So I think that the one thing that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about now and also coming back to, because we feel very confidently already that perhaps the biggest driver and the most important factor when it comes to analyzing cooling techniques is depth. And this chart behind you, I think, provides a lot of evidence to support those claims. Basically, you're just seeing a breakdown of half-inch depths. And I don't mean the pan, but how high the food is within the pan. So you're seeing everything from 1 up to 4, and then it's 4 and higher is all grouped together. And we have those same risk categories within these results as well. And you kind of begin to see this line in the sand at about 2.5 inches, where we only have one recipe that's on that 2.5 inch or less side that's actually spending more than double the amount of time in the high risk zone. And you contrast that to those foods that are filled at 2.5 or greater, and really your odds of success or being compliant are averaging around 20%, but most notably, if you're going above 4 inches or even close to 3.5 inches, you have a 50-50 chance or greater of doubling your time in the high risk zone.
Right.
So
yeah, we think you should really question methods that are involving a deep fill. Deep meaning at this point over 2.5 inches, which is kind of crazy to us to say that now, because I think a year and a half ago that wouldn't have been what we said. Just guessing is kind of the understood shallow, right? But this is becoming a big driver of success.
The Office 5 in our office was like 3.5 might be pretty acceptable. We're not calling a violation there for sure. And then also when we began to like quiz our inspectors on, hey, can you understand what 2.5, 3.5 looks like just on in a metal pan? Pretty big range there. We've actually gone as far as to procure surgical grade NSF rulers that are small, quarter, half inch, 6 inches deep, that we can then bring to inspections and measure. Because you can see 2.5 inches to 3.5 inches, you have a big difference on what your outcomes are going to be. So we really hope that you challenge and uncover depth within your own organizations as well.
Yeah. This next slide gives just a quick overview of time spent in the high risk range, that Clostridium growth range, by units. So the first set of units are prep coolers and upright units.
Non-walk-in coolers, right?
Yeah, exactly. The next group is walk-ins, then walk-in freezers, and then blast chillers. There's an obvious correlation there, and I think a lot of it makes sense. Some of it relates to airflow, which is one thing that we didn't measure in our study, and I think it's going to end up being a limitation that we acknowledge pretty heavily.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the blast chiller itself, actually, they were averaging only 14 degrees of ambient air temperature, where our walk-in freezers were averaging closer to 5 degrees ambient air temperature. So you might expect walk-in freezers to be able to outperform blast chillers, but clearly some of the genius of that $30,000 is the airflow rate. And I'm sure even within units, within walk-ins, even within reach-ins, looking at airflow closer, we didn't do it. We encourage you all to go out there and do your own research. Probably has a decent impact as well.
And this next conversation is ice. Ice in all its forms. And we should start by saying, we're going to get really nuanced here, that we didn't analyze ice as an ingredient during the cooling process. And the reason is because we only saw it used twice. And we really wanted to keep things practical, right? If we're going to succeed as inspectors, if we're going to expect operators to succeed, people aren't doing things, why bother wasting our time on it?
I mean, and theirs as well, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we really want to get this digestible into a few short things. Ice as a means to cool the food down from 135 to 41, we're just not seeing it. Yeah. But we are seeing ice in other facets, right?
Yeah, definitely.
The ice bath, for example, we're seeing used as a technique about a quarter of the time. And you are not misreading this slide. People who are using ice baths are spending on average 4.6 hours in the high risk zone. Contrast though to those that do not use ice baths, they're spending 3.4 hours on average in that high risk zone. And we kind of think this harkens back to a little bit of over-reliance or overconfidence or perception and reality maybe not quite matching up. And I kind of have a good, personal anecdote story to kind of go along with this. And as I was listening to Cindy's presentation and thinking about those restaurants that are well documented and well developed, I got this great place that I got a chance to interact with 2 weeks ago downtown. It's a corporate chain. It's a high dollar place, clean place, great practices. They even have within their recipes the CCPs defined. And in all their cool down recipes, they have it highlighted, big bold numbers. They have a cooling log that their prep chef uses every single day, filled in every single line, right? They also use ice baths. They fill them 5.5 to 6 inches deep and they whisk them all afternoon long. And to all that chef knew is that they were knocking it out of the park, because unfortunately their prep cook was dry logging that sheet every single day. 3 out of 4 recipes that I observed spent more than 5 hours in that high risk zone. And those logs were showing times of complete cooling that are closer to 3 to 4 hours. It's ice baths, there's a lot that's going on there. I think we have to be critical when we examine how sustainable they are, how consistent they are. What are the other things that are going on in the restaurant that might indicate how effective that ice bath is? But we should probably get into ice wands too, right?
Yeah, the next one is ice wands. A little bit less, 20% of our data set used an ice wand. And they did perform better on average, 3 hours in the high risk zone versus 3.9 for those recipes not using an ice wand. We do want to kind of dive into a closer examination of ice wands, because I think we're personally becoming a little more critical of them. And give some color to the numbers.
I mean, not just that, but also our data set, out of those 19% that use the ice wand, 10 of them, so almost about 20% of them, chose to use them in shallow metal pans. So that might not be conducive to what a more typical retail food practice is. Usually when we see an ice wand, we see them combined with larger, deeper foods. How else can you get the wand in the food after all, right?
We're kind of guessing that maybe they wanted to impress us that day and they busted out the shallow metal pan and the ice wand in the freezer.
Or other techniques are really driving the boat, right?
Exactly, yeah. So if we pull up a closer examination of kind of the classic ice wand use, which is a plastic container, and that's all these recipes you're seeing behind us are all plastic containers. They're colored by those that did make it, so 2.5 hours or less in that high risk zone, and those that did not above it. You can see it's about a little less than half are making it. Yeah. And so we wanted to figure out, we were asking ourselves, why? Why are these people that are using deep containers with ice wands making it? So we jumped into these first 4, these first 2 on the left.
Right, so the first 2 on the left, actually, this individual's kind of got a cool technique. It is the same facility, the same operator, the same person in charge, and the same corporate person who actually writes out their recipes for them amongst all their locations. So they do add ice, but they don't do it as a method to cool the food from 135 to 41. Rather, foods that come off the stove, they've calculated that 2 quarts of ice equals 1 quart of water. So they've replaced half of their water with ice, and it's the first thing they do when it comes off the stove. So it was used as a knockdown step to get the food from 190 down to 135. It did it right away, tempted it, vetted it, saw it both at the same time by different prep cooks even. And then immediately added an ice wand, put it into a half-size Cambro, and threw it into the walk-in freezer. So there's quite a bit more going on there than just throwing this in an ice bath in the middle of the prep area and walking away from it. Yeah. There's a lot of other active steps that are going into it. Yeah. But, I mean, it was good results.
Yeah, and just like that one, the 2 on the right didn't use the ice, but they were also mixed. The chef at that place verifies that the ice wands don't go in until 130 degrees. They're not wasting their ice wand. And then they put it in a walk-in freezer, not a walk-in cooler.
Right.
We had one more ice wand that was successful overall. And this one, it was using 2 ice wands instead of just 1. And this person also verified that they both went in at 135, not above that.
I think there's one trend that I noticed right away here, and that's the idea of waiting to put the wand in. It's the idea of maximizing the effect of the wand. I mean, maybe it makes sense. If you put the wand in at $1.70, it's probably going to melt before it even gets closer to 135. Then you just upped your depth. Then you just have a warm piece of water inside of your food, right? And we can see those cooling curves and show them to you, and then just kind of, tailing off right away. Definitely not effective. But we also began to think, and maybe more so you than me, was, wait a second, do we want to walk around saying vent your food for a few hours before you put the wand in? That does maybe have some sticky areas for us,
yeah,
right?
So if we're going to tell people to vent their food, I'll go ahead and give my 2 cents with a word of caution in that we saw some recipes above 135 sometimes with the data logger, and so we kind of pulled those out and looked at them just separately. One of them was going from 190 to 135 degrees, so it came off a simmer. It was filled 11 inches deep. This took 6 hours just to get from 190 to 135. We saw another one came in from 160 to 135, 5.5 inches deep, that took 3 hours.
I have to assume, since we wrote the SOPs together, that you're also putting the data logger in the hottest part of the food, the center amount of the food. Right. We can probably easily extrapolate that those sidewalls on top of the food is definitely getting to 135 faster, right? They have their own little microbiomes, their own little cooling curves, and their own little pockets where we can see spore former growth, toxin growth, etc. So you can imagine how there's still a fair amount of public health risk here in this situation.
Yeah. I just don't think that it's practical necessarily to tell people to cool or vent their foods on a countertop for multiple hours before they add their ice wand in. I mean,
These weren't even countertops though, right?
oh, yeah, these were in units. That's right. These were in cold environments. Imagine how much longer it might have taken in a refrigerator, or excuse me, on the counter.
Right.
Yeah. And there was some correlation to how long these recipes ended up spending in that high-risk zone when they ultimately did cool. So, I don't know, something to think about there with the venting situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what it really, hopefully, is starting to paint a picture for you is that there are definitely ways in which we can use ice to get the job done, in ways that you can guide and look for that your operator is doing things that we think might be able to drive results. But I think that if you are seeing the ice applications of bath and wand, that hopefully you're really digging into the nitty-gritty of the process, and you're looking for some of these additional enhancers, maybe to say to get you there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, maybe you're sitting down with the operator and saying, hop on eBay and get this big bowling ball cooling wand. You got a chance to see this one time. It's almost as wide as the entire Cambro. The good news is you can find a new on eBay for $46, free shipping. So maybe you're at that point of the conversation with the ice. I'm not sure, but I don't think that it gets us to a point where it's rinse and repeat, where it's sustainable, where it's the same result Saturday evening as it is Tuesday morning or Monday afternoon, right? I think there's a lot of human interaction that goes into that process, and it's hard to write that in step 8 the recipe.
The next thing we looked at were container types, and this is one thing that we hypothesized would make a big difference, right? Plastic, metal, plastic's an insulator, metal transfers heat, and the numbers behind us do kind of support that. There's a relationship in terms of the time to high risk between plastic recipes, spending more time versus those metal counterparts.
This is probably part of the time where we should pause and just remind all of you that we're showing you statistical analysis in a vacuum, right? We're showing you container type, metal v plastic, and their corresponding outcomes. We're doing this with all of these things, cover, air gap, and and one of the two counterparts is significant when it comes to results. But this is not modeling in the essence of taking those variables and asking how do they play with each other, right? That's what our goal is to do eventually, is to actually put this all through a regression calculation where we can hold the other variables still, and we can actually account for their interaction with each other. So this is the time where we plug you to come find us next year at 2020 AEC in Manhattan. We're going to be talking there. We're going to be hopefully revealing to you our final logistical regression p-value laced model. But
it'll allow us to say, all other things equal, did container type have a difference? That's the kind of thing that we can't do right now.
Because we actually noticed a pretty interesting interaction when it came to plastic and metal. It turned out then we asked ourselves, well, how deep is plastic being filled? Maybe that's really the deal, right? Plastic's being filled on average way higher than metal pans are being filled, and it kind of makes sense when you think about how a metal pan is built versus a plastic pan in retail food settings, right? Metal pans are rectangular, they are hotel pans. They might be 2, 4, or 6 inches, but they're a fairly predictable design. Plastic, yes, you see that classic Lexan design as well, but you also see bucket type materials that can support deeper fills. So we don't know yet which one is driving the bus, but we have our own inklings, I guess you might say.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we want to leave you guys with is the confidence to go out there and challenge some of the operators that you're seeing that you're not so sure their method is working. We should mention quickly that we did ask our operators a short questionnaire. How long have you been a person in charge? How confident are you in your ability to cool? Do you know the requirements? We're probably not going to use any of that in terms of our study, but it was kind of a fun anecdote. Turns out most people are very confident in how well they cool. Most of them do not know the time temperature requirements, and they just don't think it takes very long.
But out of some way, all these folks have cooling lugs somewhere in their facility.
Definitely.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I'm going to run you through several examples of cooling curves that we saw. This is kind of the most fun thing we do every day, is we sit down and just compare cooling curves that we saw from the week and chat about them. I'm going to tell you what the method was used to cool those foods down, how long the operator thought that recipe took to cool, and then how long it actually took. So not the time in the high risk zone, but the true length, right? Stuff we would evaluate from a food code perspective. So this first one is a lentil soup. It's 5.5 inches deep. It's in a metal container. It's a soup container. It is in a prep cooler without an air gap. The operator thought it would take an hour. It took 15. This next one is our chicken curry. It's 3.5 inches deep. It's in a metal container. It's in a walk-in. Maybe in Minneapolis a year and a half ago, it's a pretty tried and true method, right? Operator thought it would take 4.5 hours. This one took 12.
I mean, I just don't think I'm calling that violation a year ago.
Right, I agree. Cheese sauce in 4.75 inches deep in a plastic Cambro with an ice wand in a walk-in. Kind of your classic ice wand scenario, right? Ice wand, walk-in, plastic container. Operator thought it would take 2 hours to cool. It took 21 hours. This next one is a pork shoulder. It's a hearty pork shoulder. It's 4 inches thick. It's in a metal container. This operator was really excited. He told me I'd do a knockdown in the freezer for an hour. That freezer's real cold. And then I put it in the lock-in. They thought it would take about 4 hours to cool total. It took 18 hours to cool that pork shoulder. And our last one is a pulled pork. So this one's been pulled, and it's been pulled hot, so it's cooling down. I think it's even that photo we saw earlier, maybe, I'm not sure, in that bus tub.
It is.
Yeah, it's 3.5 inches deep. It's in that plastic bus top. It's in a walk-in cooler. The operator thought it would take 3 hours to cool. It took 17 hours. I mean, I think this leaves, this is the kind of thing we've been doing every day for a year and a half. So we've become, not jaded, but realistic. I want you guys to have the confidence that I think we have now to go out and say 4 inches. I hear you that you think it's gonna take an hour, but in my experience, it's gonna take a lot longer than that. I think we need to make an adjustment. I'm gonna call the cooling methods violation today, and we'll work on it.
I think it's okay to challenge status quo.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So we'll leave you with the only slide that Nick made me put in, which is our fireside chat slide.
I am not the PowerPoint guru, but why don't you give us your last minute? Closing thoughts from Logan.
My closing thoughts before we hopefully get some good discussion going is challenge what people are telling you. 2.5 inches really has become the cutoff for us. And if you're seeing people cooling foods in containers that are significantly, or even an inch or an inch and a half deeper than that, you need to really be diving in and asking what else is going on in this cooling method to get us to success. Because we're seeing a lot of people fail, just like the FDA risk factors are seeing. We're not really seeing cooling that often. We're not really calling methods violations. Something's got to change. So I'd encourage you guys to have the confidence to challenge and fight back and get out there and fix some cooling methods.
Yeah, and I'll give you my final word as well. And I just want to take a little bit of a moment to thank all of our operators. I mean, I personally have been in over 59 restaurants over the last year collecting data, and got a chance to meet a ton of great people, a ton of great chefs, learn their stories. We saw all walks of life, whether it be James Beard award-winning chefs or first-generation immigrants who are just trying to make it all work. And it was awesome to have those experiences and to really get in deep with them and learn about their process, learn about what they're doing every day, and gain a level of trust, that level of conversation that we don't get to have every day during our inspections. And I think if we apply that a little bit into our everyday life when we're inspecting and look on ways to ask the questions, find the conversation, get on their level, we're gonna learn a whole lot, and we're gonna get some really honest buy-in and feedback. So take that back, have those conversations, come see us next year in New York. And if you all have some questions, fire them our way.